Hey there, Thomas Jockin. How you doing, Thomas Jockin? So no pressure if you can't talk, but I have been thinking about the anagon. I want to make sure I'm saying that term correctly. That's the fifth, correct? You brought that up, anagon?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm thinking anagon, I'm thinking the relation between anagon, theme, and beauty. And maybe if I say theme five more times, Mr. Luber will come. So, and I'm also thinking of it with transversality and lax. So, we've talked with Hofstadter and Sander how basically all language is analogical. Like it is like that's how language works by analogy, by the anagon. And that, this notion of kind of direct correspondence between signal and signifier, all that other stuff becomes very problematic, blah, blah, blah. So is there something about theme being what identifies which anagons, which lightning bolts? And Daniel, good to see you. I'm forcing Mr. Jockin to talk more about the root and rhizome stuff because I think this is really important. So there's something about theme, as I'm wondering if it's something about how you can identify if this anagon is one that you should, in a sense, follow. Because we were talking about the grammar of assent and this idea that you read Shakespeare, then you're taking a walk in the woods, and that you have these apprehensions. And is there a way in which the theme is that of which gives you reason to think that this particular anagon is what you should follow? That this is actually part of the reading of Shakespeare, the seeing of the limb, and then going to mom, that the theme is what in a way binds the anagon, of which also arises with a feeling of you must follow the anagon because, as we've talked about, the thematic command can emerge precisely when you realize the irony, when you realize that I've been doing X to get Y, and X is precisely why I don't get Y. And that kind of makes you go, oh my gosh, I have to change my life. So you have that thematic command. But then there's a question of how you go about changing your life. And that's when you have to do this work, this mysterious seeking of that which you don't know what you're looking for, but know it when you find it. And so you're putting yourself in these environments for this apprehension, this strike, this boom, this grasp of the anagon. But then it's as if the anagons that you string together, that you follow, are thematic. And the reason I say that is because we're constantly dealing with the question of how to avoid capture. And we've talked about how the anagon is precisely an intelligibility afforded by overlapping multiplicities that then can kind of structure thought, which is found in an intimate relationship with particularity. You have to make things particular. And then you follow the anagon. And it's almost as if theme is precisely that of which gives you reason to believe that this is the next anagon, that this is the next one. And that would be toward beauty. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on anything regarding the subject at all, Mr. Jockin, root and rhizome. And I know you're walking, so this is not fair of me to put you on the spot. And also, I'm happy to speak about anything anyone is interested in on this fine day. I've been weed eating now because apparently it's 90 in April, and the grass is growing like it's the summer. But I'm very interested on the relationship between theme and anagon in beauty, and trying to kind of put those together. And how theme, it is almost as if there's thematic anagons, and that those are the ones of which are directing you toward the beautiful, because those thematic anagons are in light of the thematic command that was pulling you out of the ironic situation that you were in without knowing it. That self-relating negativity leading toward auto-cannibalism. I'd be curious, any thoughts on the topic at all you've been having, Mr. Jockin?
So you caught me right in the tunnel, so there's gonna be massive echo. So you gotta wait until I'm out of the tunnel.
I have no problem with a massive echo because your voice is so melodious and sonorous that if it's echoing, it's all the more beautiful. So that works perfectly.
Well, it's very kind of you, Daniel. Now I'm out of the tunnel, so now
perfect.
Okay. So first things, so I think actually a good distinction. I think it's a good intuition. I've been talking to Luber about thematic command with, I think it makes a lot of sense related to this root and rhizome discussion. Part of the tension is probably traditionally this would be attributed to principle. So typically, in that language of principle, typically gets associated together. So as a result, there's the date, like the principles, which is the organizing framing of the manifold that orients your life or orients your behavior. But that's kind of the charge here, is that that seems to be what Deleuze is concerned about. That's why in the essay I made a distinction between principle and root, because principle has that danger of getting captured under an idea mode. That's also why personally I make a big distinction between eidos and idea for exactly this reason. So that's part of the tension. I think maybe Lieber, again, we can just speak more about this. I think it's probably why Lieber is so has a both of there's thema and theme. There needs to be a way to distinguish the two. So Buber's move to do that probably maps on to this point about root and principle. Likely, I have to think we're thinking through this together. So it's kind of, we're trying to map on different idea like models together. And this is an area of tension is on this point. So, but in general, though, with that caveat in mind, I think it's generally correct, mostly because I've always seen thematic commands as the hypothetical necessity from Aristotle. If there is to be such an activity, such and such must be the case. And by the way, that's directly linked to material necessity for Aristotle. These are always, the necessity is actually demand or need. It's actually not the strictest of necessity, like anarchy. It's, I think it's Shera is the mode of, and that of necessity he talks about, which is more a conditional necessity. Like if this is the case, then such and such is the mode. So a modus ponens kind of orientation. And that leads to what you're getting at, right? And I talked about my essay this week I just posted about love as a mode of matter. In a sense, it needs to be a receptivity. So what the thematic orientations give you is very much like an anagon. It gives you a certain disposition that allows you to be receptive to certain bondingness or certain or kind of forms. That's actually, this is why it relates to materiality. It allows you to have receptivity to a certain form, not others. The example Aristotle uses is a saw has to be made out of iron. An iron is a material, there's certain arrangements that make it such to be iron. If you try to make a saw with rubber, you're not getting a saw because you get denied the intellectual, the possession of the telos being revealed. Even on the strictest of points in terms of just the fixed telos of sawing as an activity, as opposed to what we talk about how telos could be understood another way, the much more abiding kind of excess. But even on the most stricter understanding about it, it still holds. So that's my initial response. Again, I'm walking in kind of mid-idea, but the tension here is that there's typically a nature distinction of principle and root to deal with this kind of problem. Because otherwise you can't really, it would probably dilute your charge as way too clean, smooth, and easy for capture.
I think so. I think that's exactly right. And what's interesting, so if I think about what makes the thematic, so there has to be a necessity. And I know Max has talked before on the idea that philosophy is interested in necessity. You know, if you get into like Hegel or some kind of deep, philosophical inquiries, it's like not merely probability, but necessity, that there's some sort of compelling. But the problem is all necessity could serve power, right? Or it would seem as if that would be the problem. Unless you have a necessity of which is radically individuated, and that root, what's very interesting is root require, to me, principle can be more general. It can be more, and maybe this is wrong, but these are just kind of some thoughts I have. There's something about principle that is more over or top down. Whereas to get to the root of things, you have to really get particular, like really kind of get to it. And then the weird idea of the root is that at a certain radicalness of particularity, you can actually unveil a universality. Like a universality can be realized that can never be pulled from the root and therefore is saved from capture. Like, let's put it this way. any universality that is not embedded in a root can be captured. And Michael, good to see you, sir. So it has to stay in the root. But the only way to get to a root and thus avoid capture is in radical particularity, one of oneness, of which must surprise you. Because if it doesn't surprise you, that means there was some degree of predictability or an unneed to relate to the particularity to know the thing. So there has to be a radical particularity. And of course, then if virtue particularizes, you could also make an argument that it may not actually be the case that access to the root of which is present in all particularity is equally accessible, because some people may be fungible. They may not have virtue. They may lack sainthood, and therefore getting to know them in particularity may actually not afford the same access to the root as would someone who has been particularized by virtue, or who, let's use the categories we've been talking with Michael. You might be better able to access the root via someone who has emotional maturity versus someone who does not, someone who, say, has come to terms with the body or who dwells in the body versus run from the body. Every single person has access, has connection with the root rhizomatically, but not all individuals equally afford encounter with that root. And it might have something to the degree that they've said, face their fears, become virtuous. And that actually has an impact on the degree by which you can access the root. So here's something. Perhaps everything I just said is a principle, but the actual accessing of the root can't be a principle. And that access is impacted by the particular virtue of the individual. Mr. Jockin, let me throw it to you, sir. Mr. Jockin.
Well, two notes. One is that this demonstrates why it's an anagon, because it's double concept. That's why. Even in the answer I talked about, right, using the image of the root with a arboreal image, right? The root is also connected to the stalk, right? To the direct centering. Principle is that center point, right? It's that centering, concentration, linearity of it. And root is the rhizomian spread, right? So kind of scale versus spread, to use your language. I think this is why you get so excited. You're getting very excited now for root rhizome part 3 on this topic, because it actually maps on very well to your modeling or language about scale versus spread. It works very well with that, number one. And number two is actually the point, because it's a double concept, you can switch it back and forth. And especially using heuristic of surprise is very important, because every root, when it gets revealed or drawn out, becomes a principle that can be articulated and imitated and reproduced. So I think that's actually very accurate of a description right there. I think very much actually, this is where I think actually related to theme is this notion of what I call of counterfactuality. This double move of the counterfactuality of the events of actual occurrence with their dispositional distance of the counterfactual, what could have been the case, right? So it's not just running the possibility in depth of the infinite possibility, nor is it basically locked into like, well, this is the fact, this is what happened. No, the interplay of the result of the shows up in that interplay distance, especially over time. Just like how, again, a rhizomian root kind of spreads over time, and it has a, quite frankly, an indefinite articulation at the beginning, but through the interplay of, quite frankly, the biography of people's lives and activity of time working through, it becomes definitive. It does, because a root system does get articulated. I think also another example, I think Deleuze does use a ant colony as an example too. Remember correctly. So it's a similar note. Those things actually are they're not clear from the beginning. They're not preset from the beginning, but they are articulated after the fact. And they definitely have a certain responsiveness to the circumstances and an articulation of definitiveness. And I find the human life is very much worse that way. And I think a big note is to kind of, again, I wish Luber and Javier should talk more about this. Is the idea of that decision of which concept you pick from, which one is it going to be? And in your general disposition of virtue is it's an activity of disavowal, right? So typically the lack of specificity when one lacks virtue, it's because there was an opportunity, a decision, a choice, and a disavowal, which was, I think was always the sucker punch is when it was perfectly rational, right? It's a perfectly rational disavowal, mostly because, again, hot take, because we'll take virtues with this. I was talking to Javier about this. Most virtue is originally acquired for people to be good. How am I to be good? To get virtue. But what is virtue's purpose? What is virtue's drive? Not what is not the desire of the person who tries to get virtuous, but what is the drive of virtue itself? It's for the beautiful. This actually maps on to the essay I wrote this week, where I pull back from Dietima's speech in Symposium, where she's pointing out the relation with Eros to beauty, to Kalos, is, you misunderstand. The Eros is not for the beautiful. The Eros is for the begetting and engendering in the dwelling of beauty. That's a super subtle move. This actually maps on to that concentric circle discussion of the transcendentals right there. So I see in a similar note here is that ultimately when it comes to virtue is there might be a first move of it, the desire to be good, which has goodness to it. But when we take it to the limit, eventually we'll ask the question, are you doing this for beauty or for goodness? And that disavowal of those critical moments of that decision to be made, those choices, decides everything. I think you said before, Daniel, there are a person's life's decided by like 4 or 5 critical decisions, right? Destiny gets decided by those things. And by the way, actually in that Symposium section, it's not an accident that one, Destiny is specifically pointed out, the god of destiny, Moria. It's actually also very interesting is the translation is different, but it's generally the goddess of childbirth is mentioned in that section. But in later traditions, it get converted into, I believe, the Lady of Travailia, remember correctly, which has a biblical representation of like basically the activity of laboring beauty, laboring, giving birth, that kind of notion. And it's actually, and also, by the way, the notion of like the antithesis, the antagonism of beauty, right? The contrary of it, of shame, as we just, it actually, it's Haitema speaks, it coils away from being. It shrinks away. It denies begetting and shrivels and dies and labors in death. There's all this language about that. So, and when you're in shame and you're still generating, that's the catch. So you're in labor. So you're still generating. So you're participating in beauty, but you're in pain now. Now labor shows up. Now this activity of beauty is actually painful to you. I find that very interesting, mostly because of, again, Javier should speak more about this. This is more his house, but I was noticing too, because I was reading some Lacan recently, or about early this semester for a student, for her reading group. But it was that this idea of the beautiful actually being painful, right? That the strike of the real, beauty is the real in the Lacanian language. It's that dispositional state of the encounter of it. Will you be one of basically destiny, or will it be of labor and suffering? I find that really interesting. I also got some very interesting biblical modes to it. I can imagine you going playing with that, Daniel. But anyways, that's all I have right now.
Oh, magnificent. A number of things come to mind. First off, that point that beauty, we talked about how there's a danger in doing holy things without courage, because holy things can destroy you. And without courage, you don't have the virtue by which that holiness doesn't destroy you. Many people's lives are ruined by joy. Like if you encounter joy, like Lewis and people will talk about this, like if you encounter joy, it can make you bitter and envious and angry. We kill, so there's something about one of the reasons perhaps we have conflated beauty and good is precisely to avoid beauty, because joy judges. Joy brings judgment. Like when you encounter joy, if you taste a quality of life that you have not made decisions or choices or sacrifices to afford yourself, then you can naturally seek to destroy it. Naturally seek to obliterate it so that you can avoid its judgment. People say they want happiness, but when they encounter it, they actually feel judged by it and they want to kill it. So there's a few things. So the root rhizome point, yeah. If the root rhizome question cannot be properly addressed, then there is no possibility of universal singularity, which we've talked about with Cadell, and we've talked about this idea of a way for people in their singularity or their definitiveness to have something universal in common. If the root rhizome question cannot be addressed, then that's not possible. And we are going to see a regression to anti-pluralistic forms of society that will have major political ramifications, and that's happening now. And that will only get worse and worse. So it's a major question. To me, thinking on the principal root thing, there's a few things that come to mind. It would seem as if a root is that of which no principle derived from it threatens to make the root capturable. Like a root is that which, no matter how I articulate it, it doesn't actually make it more capturable, which is a major claim. Because basically something to lose, and many people will get at, is that the moment you put it into language, it's now intelligible, therefore it is at risk at capture, right? So what would it mean to have something that no articulation of makes the thing more capturable? That would, and yet in a way makes it more intelligible. What would it mean to make something more intelligible and thus that which we can meaningfully pursue without entirely knowing what it is that we're pursuing? So that's a trick, right? It would seem as if we as human beings, to develop in this way that's not capturable, we need to have a sense of something we can pursue without knowing entirely what it is. I would argue that is to pursue root in this way that we are describing, which ultimately is lack, beauty, and all these different things, right? Like when we're going around looking for something that we don't know what we're looking for, there's this sense of a kind of searching for principles that point that as we search, we gain the capacity to recognize the root if we encounter it, and yet no articulation runs the risk of making the root not surprising, not definitive, not striking, and that of which can be captured. So there's also something where, again, I guess what I'm pointing at is to the degree a person is a saint, or to the degree that something is beautiful, is to the degree that encountering them is likely to be an experience of the root. Like not just the principle, but the root. Which then there's a mysteriousness to the root, because you have a sense that it's the most real of the most real, but it's really hard to articulate why, because it is the particular encounter of the saint. It is not a syllogism. It is an experience. So you're led to an experience of which is the thing you're looking for that cannot be turned into a map without losing it. It is in the inarticulatable, but just because it's inarticulatable is not because it is unintelligible, in a sense meaningless, but that its saturation of meaning exceeds that which can be put into words. You'd have to write a novel, maybe. Like the more you approach something that's like a saint, the more making it intelligible requires writing something like a novel or a poem or, a philosophical treatise, which of course, here's the funny thing, the longer and bigger the work is, the more it can be interpreted. So then there's an irony here, because to really accurately describe an experience of the root, you have to make that which makes more space for interpretation, which then makes it, in a sense, debatable, right? So the fullness of a thing is only captured or approached better in getting at in a expression that affords more interpretation, which then makes the expression questionable and doubtable, but then also, funny enough, more communal. And that's something very interesting, is that the more you try to accurately portray a saint, the more you can't help but make a space that affords relationship and communality. And that actually becomes evidence that you were dealing with a saint. Or a real experience of beauty, evidence that you were dealing with a real strike of beauty is the fact that the better you are at accurately describing it, the more it necessitates interpretation of what you went through, which means it creates more space for community. But then, funny enough, if it makes more space for community, that makes it less capturable. So it avoids the Deleuzian problem, right? Because you can only get at it by bringing more in. But if you have to bring more in to get at it, then the mechanism of capture would always be x plus 1 before it captured. And so it would be always adding something else, and therefore it would never arrive at capture. The way you thwart Deleuzian capture is x plus 1. Like whatever you arrive at, you need a 1, right? So then the capture mechanism never finishes because it has, and you kill it. We have to. What I'm getting at is and then anyone can speak on anything. You have to overcome. The only way you overcome capture is by basically x+1. By making the mechanisms of capture fall into their own spurious infinity, where they can never complete processing. It's like the halting problem almost in computer science, I believe it is, right? And you do that, and the encounter of the saint does that precisely because an accurate description of them must approach a novel which approaches the interpretations of the novel, which always makes a kind of an emergent, unfolding activity of the debate of that discussion. I'll throw it to Daniel here, of which itself must be captured. And then the capturing itself can change how the people behave, which itself must be captured. And you have an x+1, on and on and on and on. And it becomes spurious, right? So that's always what's very interesting is that saints or beautiful moments, isn't it interesting how it just seems as if the conversation about them never ends? Right? Of course, this is obvious in religious traditions, Islam, Christianity. It's like, haven't we been doing this for thousands of years? Yeah, and it's like it hasn't even started. Isn't it weird how it kind of feels like religions haven't even started? You get that also in philosophy a little bit. Like, wait a minute, isn't it? Oh, I thought these things were over. And suddenly it feels like it's just beginning. I think that's because we finally created infrastructure like the social coordination mechanism to afford a radical encounter with the interpretation that actually creates the life. And also there's more and more of an awareness of we're actually dealing with the beautiful, which then actually explodes it. It actually makes it like erupt into a full ecosystem of thinking, which then creates this feeling of, oh, philosophy's finally starting. Oh, religion's finally starting. Huh. Well, that's also too, that kind of effect is what an encounter with the saint can do, or the beautiful, that then creates an inability of the capture mechanism to work because of the halting problem. You always have an x+1, and it goes on and on. So that's kind of a reason why this seems to have an ability to deal with the problem of capture Deleuze is getting at. But I will pause and throw it to Daniel. Daniel, thank you for being here today, sir. I hope you're doing well.
No, it's always lovely to be here. This ecosystem of thought, it's incredibly nourishing. I mean, the beginning of this year, I've been really in one writing project, so I haven't everything's kind of been neglected for the sake of that, attending less net and but very, very, very fruitful. And it's just like a kind of riffing on the ecosystem. There was a particular dark moment in this effort to write something, and I think the net was on life, and it was just a nourishment because it was speaking directly to that, to that kind of labor. And I suppose I haven't had an opportunity to express a kind of a gratitude for that, but having a listen to that conversation during a break was really there were a few kind of slivers in that have just stuck with me. And something I think it was Alex Ebert who expressed something about the dilemma that one faces when an idea, a concept that one has been pursuing has fallen dead, and that you know that if you try and pick it up again, there's something false in that effort. That's brutal, and it's something like a practice of loss, like a trusting and releasing. And I mean, the image that I came to at the end of this writing, which I think is pretty resonant with the themes that have been in this conversation, is fire. Like this idea of something. What most struck me, this like the Second Coming poem of Yeats, the widening of the gyre and the center cannot hold and things fall apart. Then I was thinking about fire as a model for a center, and also thinking about grace in relation to fire. And something struck me about like you offer something to fire, like a log or a stick, and it receives it, but it doesn't only receive it, like it takes to it. The flame takes to it and it consumes what it's given. So it's like there's something beneficial. There's also something that stabilizes a center, that is the receiving and taking to. This like something consumptive. So, and the gift of that consuming, of that place into which one can offer and it is received, is in the very offering. So there's something about like it's simultaneous. I mean, in the image of fire, we do get the warmth or the heat. So the image breaks down at a point. So like we can cook food, or but there's something about that taking to, like a center. And I think in the middle of the conversation, Roots and Rhizome, Thomas quoted Umberto Eco. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was around death, the deathbed of the beloved, seeing beauty in that. And yeah, I've been gravitating more and more to the thought of loss. But that's maybe for another stage at another point. But it's in this theme. I get so this the move that you're making, Daniel, in terms of the transverse and the transverse as this like, so strike is a good language there, because it's this. And you and Thomas were using the language of present absence. There's the present absence of the root, and also this inevitability of coming to express, and then you capture something in something that then can be usurped as a principle, and then you can go in the cheap to lose direction, and just producing multiples, trying to get away from consistency. But then there is this center, or this fire-like center that can take in, and the more it takes in, the more it gathers. The more singular it becomes, also the more it gathers, but it's also unplaceable. There's something about it that can't be captured, and then it's the gesturing towards the singular person. And I suppose also just images that I'm just contributing at the moment is the your movement, Daniel, from like universal to particular to definitive. So the example that you use with Michelle and then the institution of marriage, like the institution of marriage is the social form that is a kind of tutoring of love, and it contains this definitiveness. And then love as something like this context, like Cadell likes to point out with the often cited reason for divorce as irreconcilable differences. And then he says like differences are irreconcilable. That's what they are. So marriage is like this this institution for that learning. I have this this hesitation to beauty, or and I don't feel a rigidity in holding that as the grand telos, and also around the particular individual who might catalyze that laboring that Thomas just brought in with the symposium. Giving birth, is that ever not like a laboring? And what is it for an individual to birth an internal difference? like to become rooted, like that would seem to be what that would be in some way, to host difference, to take in difference. I mean, in the writing, I came to a point of impossibility where all I could write to, I was restarting every day, and all I could write after successive failures was like, I've taken in something that I can't assimilate. Like I've I've eaten something that I can't assimilate. The one, I think the form of the concept of contradiction is like a minimal packaging for this. And then existentially, I think it's a loss or death. What is it to take that? What is it to take that in? And then my thinking went to kind of Eucharist and like what does it mean to take that in? But I guess that's a lot of logs to contribute, and then last appreciation, like this root and rhizome. Well, this the third moment, but the prior two conversations have been super fruitful, and something really came through for me there with the way that you're beginning to bridge the transverse and the analogical. It's like a development in the logos, the concept of logos. But let me shut up now. I'll pass it back.
I appreciate everything you just shared, and thank you for your kind words. And it was interesting as you were speaking. It is very interesting to think of the anagon as fire, which itself is analogical, because in a way we could say, you know what fire is by, it's almost like you know what fire is by how it illuminates everything around it more than its own composition. And I know, Jockin, we've spoken about fire before, and that's exactly what an anagon does. It illuminates more. It illuminates. I'm going to die. I don't know what I swallowed. Like a friggin' stink bug or something. I'm done. It was great, guys. Got something in the friggin' garage. Probably all that grass in the air from when I was weed eating. But anyway, there's something about fire, like you recognize fire by how it illuminates things around it. And I like it as well because if you try to directly get at it, it consumes, right? What creates intelligibility without getting captured has to be like that. In the sense if the thing itself doesn't consume direct efforts, then it can be captured. But if it consumes things that directly get at it, and yet at the same time illuminates the things around it, like lack is, then that is precisely an anagon of anagon, in the sense of it is this thing that you can't directly get at, but you know it by how it illuminates things around it, right? Like the anagon, just I guess an obvious example with health that may not be technically correct, but if I were to say, that light is healthy is an example I've seen. Well, lights don't have health, and you know exactly what I mean. And yet, what makes a light healthy? What the heck? And yet there's a way in which your relationship with the light can be can grow because it's green and you see it. You say, oh, that means it's working. But that's really weird, right? That I can say that light is healthy and great. So there's a way in which what's happening is something, the fifth, the anagon, is illuminating a way to understand and be toward the light based on how I describe it, right? So an anagon has this kind of character of illuminating things around it. But if you try to get it at directly, it consumes all efforts. It's not reducible, right? That is precisely a form of intelligibility that can't be captured, which is costly to lose versus cheap to lose. And it would seem as if the possibility of an anagon as such requires transversality. It requires these layers that are atop one another, that almost because they are, it is precisely because of their simultaneity with one another that it is possible for them all to be illuminated at the same time by an anagon, of which their very simultaneity affords, right? And so then, boom, I have a way of understanding them all. But if I try to consume them, then they go away. I lose it, right? So in a funny way, the only way to avoid capture is that which consumes, which of course has a Eucharistic sort of language to it, because the consuming has this illuminating. Now, I also like this because there's something about the saint of which illuminates everything around it, right? Like when you're in the presence of a saint, there's a field and you actually feel a kind of illumination, like the things around the saint come out. Actually, for good and for bad, because if the saint is around someone who has a vice that they haven't dealt with, that vice comes out, right? Like they want to kill the saint, right? So the very presence of the saint draws out, right? And I think the same for beauty as well. And certainly it's understandable to have a a certain hesitation with the notion of beauty. I will say a reason for me it becomes so important over the years is because it's such a deeply, in my opinion, misunderstood concept. And I think if we think of beauty as actually more of this thing of which draws out everything around it for good and for bad, then beauty can be a very miserable experience. Like, I think that's also really important to realize, is an experience of beauty can be miserable because it brings out your vices, right? Beauty should not be conflated with this wonderful experience. It's Lovecraftian, with the craft in parentheses, this play of Dante and love. It puts a very real demand on you, of which then you will be very tempted to deny, because nobody likes seeing themselves, in the deepest sense. But anyway, the saint has this character of illuminating everything around it, like an anagon, like fire. And yet, if you try to say what the saint is, it consumes all definition. Like it burns up all reductionism, all trying to put into words. There's a reduction that occurs. Beauty does the same. Like any effort to try to say what it is or to articulate it has this way of consuming that effort. And the experience of it, nevertheless, has an illumination. But that illumination is interesting because it brings forth, it brings out, like beauty illuminates something that, physical light can't illuminate, right? Because when I say like illuminate, like there are, because we all have depths inside of us that are kind of invisible, that don't come out, that we don't even know are there even, or that the people like that, because we're self-deceived, but the presence of the beauty or the saint brings those things out, right? I think the same thing happens with an anagon. I'll throw it back to you, Daniel, is because in an anagon, there's this apprehension. I didn't even think all these things related. I didn't think Hegel and Deleuze and Christian and all these things related, and then it all kind of comes out. Whoa, like I didn't even know that was there. But in the kind of mixing or being in the presence, this thing can come out that has this illumination. I'll pause and throw it to you, Daniel. Daniel, please.
No, that's awesome. I maybe just want to follow this image of the lightning bolt is very close to the way that I was hearing the transverse there.
Yes.
The transversality. And so there's this simultaneity. There's something like a simultaneously crossing planes. I can't help but imagine some kind of friction. Then there's a strike, and the strike, as you're saying, it illuminates things around it, like the strike of lightning. I remember just a few weeks ago, before the net, I'd been walking and lightning had struck very close, and had this very close impression of that crack. Then a couple weeks later, I was listening to a storm in the distance, and there was obviously lightning, but the distribution of that sound, of the thunder and the lightning, was far more well distributed. So those two sense impressions that were very relatively proximate for me, of being like right in the crack of the lightning, and then the kind of distance of this rumbling thunder. And because I'm like a bit dumb, I realized that's the same phenomena, but for some reason that struck me, because these two sense impressions were pretty close to each other. It struck me that cracking and then that rumbling, it's the same phenomenon. So maybe Levon Chantal writing and around the philosophy portal, she's doing work on she's kind of when she uses this phrase, it's like lightning. It's like the phrase is intersubjective destitution. And this is obviously like developing this notion from psychoanalysis of subjective destitution, like becoming destitute in some sense to authority figures in one's life or hopes for the future, and the sense that there's kind of a freedom in that process. And then you have Peter Rawlins as the Church of the Contradiction, and he's working at an institutional or like a social level and wanting to use liturgy to free the social substance from the presence of a big other, as trying to like develop a technology for this, pushing into like the social forms. And then Levon is experimenting, thinking, theorizing around this idea of intersubjective destitution. And she uses an image for, I don't know if I get it right, but it's like phosphorescence. It's this brief moment of light, and then it fades. Like she'll use examples of she used a wonderful phrase, a holy impasse. She's describing a situation that she came into with her husband where it was just an impasse. And this holy impasse between them, and something in the shared air, because it can also feel like a vacuum, or it is there's a loss of air, but there's something of a staying with. There's something. Other phrases we've been using is feminine fidelity. We've been wondering about the difference in the disciples' response to the crucifixion, and looking at Mary, and what does this say about the gesture of fidelity. I think Substack that Levon wrote was staying with. Like what is that? What is the staying? What is the staying with? So I guess I'm gathering more because I'm trying to resist the temptation of the strike of lightning. Is the mistake that Deleuze is not pointing at, is to imply from that strike an anagon or a principle, that the strike doesn't light something up. It's and that's where like the destitution might come in. It's a vaporizing, it's a reducing to nothing. It's like the substantiality was prior to the strike, causing the friction, the strike, and then I'm not sure what to say, and then like a nothing, but that temptation is at least there. And this basic category of negativity or nothing, or that would be there at loss. Which in what you afforded, Daniel, in terms of the transversality, was the freeing of the concept of the logos as a through line, an intelligible through line, into something more lightning-like and absent. Yeah, let me pass back.
No, it's outstanding questions. And I'll throw it to Mr. Jockin here. So the first thing I would say is that Deleuze would not think the anagon solves this problem, because I think Jockin is correct. He's thinking of it as a Kantian, which is understandable because that is also the dominant understanding of analogy, but it's also not the only. And he ends up, in my opinion, describing transversality, which is actually the anagon. It is more the catagen without him realizing it. Now, critically for him, and this should be made clearer, and I'm sorry if it has not been, the transversality is more of an ontological description. It is not epistemological. Like his understanding of how, because he has to answer the question of how things stay the same when there's change. Almost the very first, almost metaphysical question. Like if there's only change and flow and processes, right? There's no stable substance, then why is that cup still there? Right? Why is it not chaos? Right? So he wants to explain that actually basically the overlap, he does not use the word overlapping. I kind of wish he did because I think it makes things a lot clearer. He wants to claim that the very overlapping of processes creates stability in their continual processing, which then creates the transversality. So if you have a continual physical process that is simultaneous with a continual biological process, which is simultaneous with a continual chemical process, you get a thing called a squirrel. And that squirrel is a product of difference in itself, because there is no similarity, there is no sameness. It is the difference arises across the layers, and thus a thingness of itself. So basically, as I understand Deleuze, which I cannot guarantee I do, but as I understand Deleuze, is basically he's solving the problem of what is substance by saying substance is transversality. That is how you get constant. And for Deleuze, and I'll throw it to Jockin, this is a very big deal because he thinks otherwise most metaphysics is going to end up, especially when you talk about substance, it will be univocal. It will have like a constant substance, and he thinks that politically means we're doomed. We're doomed for totalitarianism. So he wants reality, because then, of course, it just comes back to the old metaphysical idea that what the human ought to do is align with reality. And if reality is pure difference that creates substance as transversality in its overlap, then you are, in a sense, justified for you yourself to focus on your differentiation, your unfolding one of oneness, than the establishment of univocality, say univocality by nation states that are all the same, or communities that are all the same, or religion that's all the same. He wants to basically, in this sense, as I would take it, basically suggest it is therefore ethically justified to focus on difference, because difference is reality, and substance is simply a transversality of overlapping difference. So his push on transversality, which again, the word transversality is not one he uses often. I really freaking wish he does. I think he's basically always and constantly describing it, especially when he gets to his works of cinema. But I think Deleuze also kind of had a bit of an incentive to use lots and lots of terms, which I can do myself sometimes, so I can't entirely judge it, precisely to avoid capture, right? To kind of have all of these things going on. And Clayton, wonderful to see you. The move I want to make, that Jockin and I are discussing, and that Jockin has brought out so critically, is that there actually is an epistemology that is like the ontology of transversality, which then means it's possible to have epistemology which is shared, that aligns with reality. You see what I'm saying? In Deleuze, only basically the individual can align with difference, which then, of course, transforms the individual into the dividual. He gets rid of individual for dividual, and the dividual is a multiplicity that is itself via transversality. But he's stuck, in my opinion, he's stuck with the moral, and I there's moral and ethical are not the same, but like what you ought to do can be used by, say, a person to determine their action of increasing difference and creativity and multiplicity, but it's stuck there. You can't really expand it to the social, right? So the social suffers dramatically in Deleuze. In fact, the social is doomed, in my opinion. But if there was an epistemology, not just an ontology, but an epistemology, and therefore onto-epistemology, that actually was also like transversality, we now have a way to take seriously Deleuze without destroying the social. And that's what the anagon does. And so that changes the game. And then the question simply becomes how to increase the conditions of possibility for the average person to have that experience. And yeah, basically to focus the logos on the anagon, to really focus on that. Now, I have a lot more to say about difference and sainthood, but I really appreciate what you were saying. But let me throw it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, I'm finally in a place I can talk, actually. So, yay. Daniel, I think your notes about the social community generated from the basically individual saints, spot on. I mean, actually, we see that. The very fact that technically, I mean, it's considered a derogatory statement, but a Mohammedan would be the Oriental's language of Islam. This is not incorrect in the sense that it was the activity of one man whom oriented an entire civilization, right? So, and actually similar with Christians, right? Or even more simple actually with the saints in terms of basically, oh God, my mind's blanking. Franciscans, for example, the different saints built, like Augustinians, like entire communities got generated from individuals. So I think this relationship is, we actually see the facts in history to show that. So it has been done, like this has occurred. So it's not, this is actually validated by those points. I think the big note, I mean, I got to be honest, this whole discussion is again, I don't feel qualified to speak about this. This is much more the Javier and Luber game to talk about this. Look, this is the limit of psychoanalysis of the good. In terms of the question of the transferality of the good into the beautiful, that is what's at play here. Because all social coordination has been based on the predication of the good. Like that's what it's all oriented around. And actually, as we said in the essay, and I wrote in the essay, and we talked about a little bit, right? Actually what grounds the common good to not be a mode of capture is an orientation around the beautiful, right? So that's the move that's happening here. And that's actually why, hey, your comment, like we've done all this work in philosophy and religion and politics, yet it seems like the work has just begun. Because like all those developments, just to get to the conclude, like get to at least our insight, to say, oh, right, beauty. Right, and I think actually the big note is, listen, beauty is absolutely that object, that analogical, anagon concept term that is uncapturable. It doesn't have that power of being captured, which is inherently its weakness. Its fragility is inherently that, right? In the sense that, and that's actually the huge anxiety. Is like, how are you going to have a social coordination around a concept that can instantly be transformed and reoriented and lost? How are you going to do that? Isn't it just easier, Daniel, to just do the good? And that's exactly right. That's my method of disavowal of the beautiful for the good. It's safer. This is why courage is so important. I think also the notion of articulate, and we talked about it, kind of joking about it on the conversation, the video conversation about Ruth and Rhizome 1, which is the charge of ad hocness. The key I think the counter charge would be, well, wait a minute, your argumentation of ad hoc improvising, is that not based on power? That'd be the counter charge, right? That, oh, certain individuals their ad hoc readings are more valid than others. Isn't that just a game of power about who gets to just basically get their Rhizomian anagon, to use that language, which that one getting captured, like for a spread to a multiple people, which of course, see, that's the language. Notice there's this anxiety about being captured at the good, right? So there's to kind of push back. This is the tension. I think probably, I'm sure you have an answer, Daniel, but my first instinct is, well, the whole point of this is to engender beauty in others, which must be different. This is why a friend's courage is not the same as your courage. Otherwise, it falls into mimetic capture, because you just want to capture what they have, which is exactly why you're right about when people see beauty, they hate it, right? They get judged. And more importantly, because they have, I mean, it's funny because it's typically used in kind of a derogatory language of like magical thinking of abundance of, well, no, the world is limited. There's constraints. It's zero-sum game. If you get something, I get less. I don't get it, right? This is kind of like analog in terms of like anything you get, I lose. Well, that's not the logic of the beautiful at all, because actually the point is that, no, in beauty, things engender. So even activity of courage. So if someone gets courage, there's an activity of courage or victory or anything like that. In jealousy, because you want to capture the same thing. That's a mode of goodness. In beauty, you go, that shows it's possible. How might I have courage? And it'll be very different because of our limitations, constraints in the situation. But that's we have to be aware, this is a completely different orientation of social order. It's a completely different orientation. Yeah, nice. So I just want to point out the charge here, or why it actually, on one position about it, it is incredibly dangerous in a Deleuzian mode. Because it's like, basically, if someone to go down this route and goof it up by really still being under the good, It's just going to be, you know what, again, the closest parallel would be right now is parasocial relationships of influencers online, in which in the visual desire of operation, they basically inculcate an orbit of people who just relate to them and ground their orientation to that person, but they don't actually change and don't transform into their own sainthood, right? So I think Daniel, in terms of talking through this, that'd be one of the challenges of this, is that, because I bring this up because of oh God, I forgot his name. He wrote the book, I think Daniel Frege, he wrote the book Ontological Design, and he's borrowing this idea of the visuals. And he's saying an individual is not an individual. They're individuals by their flow of the algorithmic desire of their spaces and their tools that make them. So our answer would have to address, any answer to this would have to point out that is how this is playing out right now. This is already happening, Daniel, like this mode of cheap delusionism you're talking about. We're using the digital technology where people are getting individuated or divisuated into their algorithmic desire. And then people are in their irascible and their kind of thematic over excessive operation, just putting stuff out there on the internet, getting huge, actually being captured by their algorithmic desire, by the way, because if you actually talk to these individuals, you find out their obsession with quantification. And then it's also a very clear indicator that they know they're captured by the good. Because how many followers do I have? How many views did I get? Right? Look what they're obsessed about. Look what their intentions on. And that typically results in doing things to get more attention, right? So that's something, I think that's actually the big charge of this idea is how does someone read this, listen to this, consider these ideas, and not just go and say, oh, parasocial social relationships, just get more followers and get a basically social cult, a parasocial cult that are just gonna, like in the visual, libidinal desire, just orient around this. That's the question I think we have to answer to. I think it's Daniel. What said you, Daniel?
I just think this is getting all to the major things. Basically, the parasocial code is going to form until forming relationships with these people online forces you to change your life and encounter that beauty that horrifies you. So there's a lot that you just said that's really, really important. Michael, good to see you again, sir. So first, there is a certain sense in which every kind of field, in my opinion, is encountering various limitations. So, and those limitations are all presenting incompleteness or an inability to think how exactly to coordinate in a manner that does not just recreate the conditions of the 20th century that prove extremely problematic, right? All right, so the limits of delusionism, in my opinion, is it avoids capture but kills the social, and it is not able to think of how to avoid capture without losing the social. The limits of psychoanalysis, I think Freud put very well. He said, we're setting people free. And then Jung was like, but what are they going to do with their freedom? And Freud's like, it's not our place to say, because if we do, we'll have transference and we'll have a big other. So psychoanalysis sets you free, or that's kind of the idea, but then it doesn't tell you what to do with that freedom. And the problem is freedom can drive people insane if they don't know what to do with it, right? So the limits of, say, Christianity, it can tell you what to do with your freedom, be like Christ, but what do you do with the person that doesn't believe in that worldview, or it's not clear how to update your beliefs to deal with drone warfare, and et cetera, so forth, right? You get into all those problems. You can fall back into a big other. Psychoanalysis also can help you understand the problem of the neurotic, which means you're seeking authority. You want the authority, and that's very problematic. And most social orders have been based on authority, like a big other. But then you can have the social order based on the perverse, which can be an enjoyment of the lack of authority, or being your own authority, or the fact that there is no big other, just having a raw enjoyment in that, or you yourself function as the big other and know that the big other isn't a big other because people are treating you as a big other and you enjoy that perversion. So there's all of that. And then there's the psychosis, which is the individual that has the problem of weak speech. They have found a speech that they can't create a social of, but they have figured out how to deal with desire in their psychosis, but they've lost the social. The psychotic and the delusion are very similar. Well, how do we get a social of synthome? I mean, it's what we've talked about with like synthome is what for Lacan is kind of hanging as this very interesting example of an idiosyncratic way of knotting the real, the imaginary, and symbolic in a way that seems to help move the individual from desire to drive. Yeah, but we have no idea how to have a communal synthome, right? So you have to have a communal synthome. How do you do that? Well, this is where things like lack and beauty and all of that are very, very interesting. And it does seem as if it comes down to these questions of theosis and theurgy, which is creating spaces where other people can become saints. Like theurgy, as I understand it, is not merely your own becoming a saint, but actually figuring out the work by which other people can become saints. And that actually then is a social that creates one of oneness. And that very theurgy, actually Theurgy, I believe, theurgy, actually then becomes a social of which is creating many, many people, a multiplicity, if you will, each of whom illuminates what is around them. But if you try to say what they are, it consumes it, right? So you have a social, a spread, that also creates Holy Spirit. And I definitely think when Zizek talks about Holy Spirit, you can associate it with this, that actually creates a communal bond that avoids capture. And this seems to be looking at something like a communal synthome. But the problem is the following. How do you make that intelligible? Like, what would it mean to make that intelligible in something that other people can engage in? So there's a few things. So first off, the reason why sainthood as we are describing it, which I think can be associated with subjectivity of drive, child, absolute knower, so on and so forth. And you could also say that I think we are in an age of global pluralism where every field is also encountering their limits and having to think their limits. Like we're in a kind of Hegelian moment in that sense. Like religions, like Christianity are encountering their limits. Like, you know, listening to people in the corner, there's this sense of the limit being encountered. There's people who are interested in communist projects encountering the limits of that, like with a Catron. I think people are encountering the limits of capitalism. Even people who I know like on Uncommon Knowledge or all these people that were more libertarian 10 or 15 years ago, they're increasingly encountering the limits of capitalism and having to think those things. Or they're like, okay, capitalism is going to cause mass unemployment, AI. What are we going to do about that, right? So there's this very interesting moment where everyone is encountering the limitation and everyone feels like weak. There's a certain weakness that everyone has. But that's kind of interesting because I think what you were describing, that the anagon has a weakness for it. Like the very ineptitude and weakness that people feel may actually be increasing the probability that the average person is willing to accept a weak center because they feel weak. And they feel as if all the strong options don't work. So maybe a weak option would work, which makes me think of like weak theology projects or something like that. And so people are interested in that, or the girdle pointer or stuff of that nature. So there's something about the creation of that feeling of weakness that I think opens up people to difference and things like that. So, but there's also something here that's just very important on the idea of the saint as we are so describing it. And Mr. Sartori, good to see you, sir. We're talking about root and rhizome. Wonderful to have you. Everyone, Sartori's awesome. And we're in the middle of talking about root and rhizome again. Thank you. And I know you've listened to those videos, and I've had some wonderful talks with Mr. Sartori here. And we were just talking a little bit on that kind of idea. And Sartori also has been doing some fantastic work on the question of a kind of using AI with the social coordination mechanism, which I think is actually tremendous, and actually using it to help us find the girdle point. So I really appreciate it. So Sartori, thank you for coming. Feel free just to raise your hand again. We've just been talking. I've been weed eating this afternoon, and I'll probably weed eat some more if I get a chance. But then I had that horrible experience where I was cutting the fence line, and then halfway through it ran out of gas. And I'm like, I have to walk all the way to the garage, then walk back, fix the cord. It's always that great moment. But I was just saying what's interesting with the saint, because like you were saying that Cadell has pointed out, like when people get divorced and they say because of irreconcilable differences. Well, it's like, yeah, differences are irreconcilable. That's what they are, right? Differences are reality. There's something very interesting about the saint that is actually creating a difference. Like the saint is different, that one of one experience, like virtue creates difference, of which then is in its difference irreconcilable of the society. Like the society can't make it intelligible to it, like it's irreconcilable. And so it thwarts the social. But in thwarting the social, it is also a revelation that we live in a society that can't make this intelligible to it. So is that the person's problem or the society's problem? And you see, when you have people who are illuminated by the saint in the way that Daniel was describing, there's a certain conviction of, well, maybe the social is in the wrong, right? But then, of course, you always have to wonder the question, is it the cult leader or something like that? But that experience of the saint creating difference, of which then draws into question the social, simultaneously invites a possibility of a new social in relation to that sainthood, in relation to that saint. So there's a new kind of quality of interaction that can then open up. And to the degree that people give themselves over to it, then actually creates a new communal space that people can interact and that they can spread and that can engage into these things that is intelligible to the people of whom are involved in that environment. But the other reason why I think, Mr. Jockin, it might work against the parasocial relationship is because when you encounter the saint, it doesn't, the first thing it does is make you feel like you suck. It doesn't, it's not like you give likes or follow or you're like, oh, it scratches the itch. You're like, oh, I've got to go face something now. I've got to overcome something, right? So far from parasocial, it is it's a demand, which is interesting because the reason I bring this up is because there therefore is a neurotic function in the Lacanian sense, but not a big other. There's a Lacanian function of authority that's kind of through the conviction or sending out, but not the same as the big other that is structuring you. But it's also interesting because the saint it has this authoritative structure, and you want to kill the saint because you don't want to actually do that thing that it sends you out to do, right? And so that works against the parasocial. But basically, yeah, if you're not able to think this one, I'll throw it to anyone who wants to speak at all on anything, is if you do not face this problem, then yeah, I think you basically end up with a bunch of parasocial delusion environments, like you're saying. You end up, that's where everyone's going to go. I'll just form these cults of people that do likes and clicks and things like that, which makes me think of a wonderful video Sartori was having about that. Instead of actually a social that is, you have to have people, and I guess I also am now thinking about that wonderful turn from Levon, and I'll throw it to you, Daniel, on this intersubjective destitution. There's something about the saint, which is the site of intersubjective destitution. I think that's kind of important. The saint actually becomes a site of intersubjective destitution, a place of it. It is here that it occurs. So it's not merely subjective because it puts a demand on you that you then have to do that arises intersubjectivity. So I think that occurs, and there's also a lightning to it. But let me pause and throw it to you, Daniel. Daniel, please.
That's great. It's I think just the one you started there, Daniel, by saying and it's also where you ended, the I think the beauty that you are then called to turn to or to face or to and that it can be horrible. And a few times it's run through my mind there's and Thomas might appreciate this in Plato's Republic, when they're doing the division of the soul, Socrates tells a story about someone walking up from the port, and there's a pile of corpses from execution or something, and the story is about his internal dialogue, and he's walking past the corpses, and then when he gets to them, he turns and he stares at them, and he's like, all right, fine, look, you wretched eyes, or whatever. And this indicates an internal conflict that he has. And he had to relent to this part of him that wanted to look at the corpses. I think my battery's low. I just need to find a charger. There's something about it. Really struck me that example. The example is corpses. It's like death, the dead bodies, and then this is kind of the theme that I've been on very much. Like, how much is this fascination? How much is the beauty in its aspect of horror, an orbiting of then what we would otherwise speak about as death, was always loss. And then repeating what Thomas said in that net and rhizome, or that was a nice slip, the root and rhizome. The net is the root. This, and I'm in the dark. I'm the dark Daniel. So the okay, yeah, there's, I mean, to see the beloved's deathbed as beautiful, and also the conversation that you and Michelle had last week, Daniel, in terms of altar and the altar, and this recent effort that I've made to write something like those images of funeral and wedding, specifically how they come together at the cross. It's just it's really something to think about. Like, there's something that the death is the proposal, or it's in death that there's a weddedness, or like that's a, I don't know, I guess not contributing much, just pointing to this aspect of the horror of beauty. And I read Lovecraft and the Cthulhu, and not your craft of love, Daniel, but the patron saint of post-metaphysical spirituality. It's a very potent image, this Cthulhu. And then at a stage, it kind of grossed me out a little bit. I was a little bit. There was something about this, the use of the horrible image. There was something insincere. I think I had Alex Ebert's words like in my mind, and I couldn't disregard that sense that I was sensing something insincere, or maybe like perverse is the right word. So it's like using the potential affect of horror, and then kind of playing on that, and that brought me to contemplating like what then is, like, this guy is walking up from the port, like what's tearing his soul, that conflict. Something in him wants to gaze at death. It wants to look at those corpses, and he has to relent to it. And then he expresses the thing that Socrates uses to speak about, oh, there must be like division in the soul, because a part of him wants to look at it, and part of Michael, that's AI vid that you did of Daniel's work on the social coordination mechanism was really helpful to me. I appreciate that.
Thank you for doing it, Michael. No, it was really great. Thank you for doing it, Michael.
Well, yeah, something just kind of clicked when I was, thinking about that. I mean, essentially, I was just, because I've gotten into the habit of every time something triggers me on X, I'm like, wait, why is this triggering me? And since it has that little grok function, I'll just ask grok, like, what is this person actually like getting at? What's their actual motivation? And then it kind of talks me off the ledge. And then I realize, like, oh, they're just, worked up about something. And a lot of times, you find out there is some, if you can eliminate some of the really particular language that might come from somebody having like a different theological or philosophical background, then you will see like, oh, we actually agree on a lot of things. Like we're the same, we're identifying the same pattern, and we're in opposition to the same other pattern. We're just using all different language to describe it. And then I basically just said, like, to the AI, it would be really great if you could be like the friend that would pass the note to the friend and be like, so I don't have to, so I don't have to worry about coming off as awkward. Like, you find out if there's interest, and then, whatever. So then that's like, well, hey, that would be a good thing for AI to do. And then I did kind of like try to mess around with it on the other end, where I just basically like said, hey, you've seen a lot of my stuff. Here's the links to my books and writings and things, and find me some people that I might not normally come across who also have some similar ways of thinking. And and it showed me a few things. I didn't really like dig into it yet too much, but yeah, it definitely has some neat capabilities.
Oh, I love that thing. Well, there's a few things with that I think is a really big deal. All of that helps us get to the girdle point quicker. And because it's extraordinary to me. So, for example, the way we the Jockin and I, and we'll talk about often about beauty, is very different than how most people mean it. So one can imagine a world where you use AI to be like, what do they mean by beauty? As opposed to having this knee jerk of basically saying, well, that's wrong. And then actually say, oh, but that's what, and the reason why that is all very important is because we were talking earlier, Mr. Sartori, about how all of these different fields, we're entering a kind of age, in my opinion, where basically every field is encountering its limit. Like the psychoanalysis, religion, philosophy, economics, all of them are encountering, as you know, I'll talk about girdle points, like incompleteness. Like in economics, it doesn't know how to create demand. It doesn't even know what demand is. It just basically assumes it, right? But this is a big deal because the way the economy works is going to completely be connected with the question of what is demand and how you create demand. And also, if you can't create demand, just stimulate it, well, then the people are going to be basically captured by the system because it can teach them what to demand, what to desire, and then capture them in this way that Deleuze is so concerned about, right? Okay, so you say, well, get rid of capitalism. Yeah, you do that. People are overwhelmed by existential anxiety. We don't have natural resources, and we go back to barbaricism or things like that. But you say, well, capital structures subjectivity in a way that flattens us. Yeah, but if you're going to expand subjectivity, then you better do some of that psychoanalysis stuff because expanded subjectivity tends to destroy people. We've been talking about how joy and sainthood, like people talk about joy and wanting happiness, but often when people encounter those things, they destroy them or they hate them or want nothing to do with it, right? Like we can say all day that we want freedom from capitalism, but then you get freedom from capitalism and you're stuck at home with your family and you find out that you never learned how to relate with them. And then you're like, I'd like to go back to my job now, right? So all of these, so how do you deal with being a human being in that sort of encounter, right? There are all these kind of limits that we need to encounter precisely to think. And the work that you're describing with AI can go a long way to like forcing us to get to the actual issues as opposed to just these misunderstandings that service map making and map sealing and all and internally. And then also the likelihood of us getting stuck in internally consistent systems is way higher if we don't actually come to the place where we encounter the limits of what our maps can map and thus face the territory. But then I guess to what you were saying there, Daniel, the moment the map isn't the territory, you are dealing with something dangerous. Or this is why this image of beauty and death and like, again, to say, the cross has become such a, the cross has become sanitized. It's basically an electric chair. Like it's not a pretty thing. It's a horrible thing, right? But you've lost the horror. But then I think there is something to be said about Lovecraftian that feels poured in from the top or horror for horror's sake. That is not actually, it's kind of trying to shake you, but it's not actually directing you toward any sort of development or anything like that. That can be like a crude deconstructionism that doesn't really lead you to the girdle point. It just deconstructs what's there, right? So then there's no demand on you. But there's something about actually kind of, I don't think you can actually, again, get to the strike of beauty in the way that we're describing unless you actually encounter limit, encounter death, actually go through one's incompleteness and weakness and things of that nature. Because that's the only way also because this gets into the counterfactuality. And then if anyone would, I think this also gets one of the reasons why beauty seems to require some relation with death or hardship is because beauty requires the counterfactual. It requires the could have been. Like when Jockin talks about his dad, or we talk like you could have complained about what life did to you. You could have been upset with being paralyzed or losing your leg. You like the saints have the saints are tortured. You know, they have good reason to be upset, right? But they don't. And that creates the beautiful. You don't have the beautiful in this way we're describing it as distinct from symmetry unless you have counterfactuality. And that also, that counterfactuality is critical to avoiding capture, because capture can't calculate all possible counterfactualities, right? The system, like all, and actually the rational thing for you to do is if something terrible happens to you is to be upset. To not be a saint. That would be, there's something about sainthood that becomes non-rational, right? Or if you're mistreated, it becomes rational for you to be upset, right? And so one of the reasons why this is also tied to overcoming capture is because it's non-rationality, and we'll talk a lot. It is menti-divergent, and Mr. Sartori has done wonderful videos on that. And like the key thing I just want to scream, not scream, but say with a raised elevation, is that the entire name of the game of avoiding capture is tied to the fact that the only way you overcome Nash equilibrium are tied to neurodiversity and which I'll call menti-divergency. And neurodiversity, that is menti-divergency, is non-rational. It is non-rational activity. The saint is menti-divergent. Therefore, they don't fall into Nash equilibria. They get an optimal result versus a suboptimal result. But in so doing, become harder to understand because you can't arrive at an understanding through rationality. You have to do it. Therefore, they strike rationality as an irreconcilable difference. They are a difference because the saint says to you, you either have to kill me or accept that rationality is not enough. You either have to like other me, or you have to realize that there are more things going on than what you believe is typical, neurotypical. You have to actually move toward the menti-divergent. And that puts a challenge on you, because how do you even, like, we much rather kill the saint, because how do you even begin deciding what non-rational thing to do? Like, what does that even freaking look like? Like, oh, I have to do the non-rational? What does that look like? Well, until we arrive at the girdle point, then actually the ability to determine what that means can't ever actually be realized, because you're just going to be engaging in map tracing or map sealing or creating indestructibility. Like, actually knowing what is the non-rational requires actually coming to the limits of your map and encountering that. And the quicker that we can get there, the better, and the quicker you can actually move toward that sainthood. So the thing I'll say, and then if anyone has anything to say on this fine evening before, I think we're having spaghetti. Maybe we will see. No, we're having, Michelle makes a wicked stir fry. Oh my gosh. If y'all ever come by stir fry, and she also makes a wicked ramen. That is really, really good. But the thing I want to say is that this relation of seemingly beauty and sainthood has something also to do with horror and death and difficulty, because otherwise there's no counterfactual to consider the saint in light of which creates the beauty. If nothing bad ever happens to someone, then when they're not bitter about it, there's no alternative world where they are bitter about it to consider them in light of, thus to create their beauty, thus to create the effect. So that becomes a big deal. But Daniel, I'll throw it to you, sir.
I just want to give a little thanks for the counterfactual illumination there, because it kind of, but also just I had an Easter egg, marshmallow Easter egg for supper, so I'm very jealous of the suppers that is ahead of you, the stir fry. Maybe I'm hating on your joy right now from the dark. Oh my word, home cooked meal. So the counterfactual, like the way I heard that, it's kind of like the grief of a child dying because of the potential that is there. There's a one like that's part of the loss that is felt, is that like there was a whole life to live, and then that lost potential can maybe feel like the gravity of it. And then the counterfactual of, say, Thomas's father, who lives a full life, and then he had a series of decisions to make, and he made some decisions instead of others, and that he made some decisions instead of others is the counterfactual singularness of his life, and that's like a weighing, or it's his weighing, or it's how he weighed life, or was weighed by life, or um what's the, because I know Thomas's article is counterfactual grace. What's the grace component there in terms of the counterfactual?
I think that's I think that's a wonderful question. First, the very fact that his father doesn't put on the people around him the fact that life mistreated, or to grieve or to be upset. Like, we've all been around someone who's bitter at life, right? And often the person who's bitter at life can have a good reason to be bitter. Something like unfair happened to them, something terrible, like their bitterness is rational, right? But that becomes a big burden on other people. And if they're not doing that, it becomes a gift, but it's a gift afforded by non-rationality. And that also, I think, shows, I'll give it back to you, Dan. And that, I think, shows you like why like the rational makes the situation suboptimal, whereas the non-rational, the person not actually emphasizing how life mistreated them, even if it's true that life mistreated them, actually creates a better space for other people.
No, perfect. That the non-rational was the clincher for me there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Sartori, please.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is literally just what I was thinking about today. This whole thing of the non-rational choice, and so I've been thinking a lot about and writing about marriage a lot, and thinking about that, and encountering some of the other worldviews and people have, and like a lot of the conservative thought, because this is like an empirically verifiable fact that women are less rational than men, and basically you kind of came to the realization, it's like, if you think that's a problem, if that's a bug and not a feature, then you are doomed, like, as a man, essentially. And I mean, this is a very hard thing to the lived experience of dealing with the non-rationality of a woman is not always so fun and exciting. But in some sense, you have to like recognize that is tied to like their beauty. If and you have to just be like, there's something about women that it will always be impossible for the male to understand fully. And the kind of amazing thing about that is that really, it's because thinking of marriage as this image of Christ, and God's view, his relationship with us as humanity or towards creation, we are in some sense like a mystery to him, like, and that, which is just kind of strange to fathom, but yeah, so it's like, if you have, so you can't if you build your framework around controlling or dealing with that non-rationality, you basically set a limit of like what your own happiness and whatever is going to come out of your relationship with your wife, or women in general. And you have to instead like think about cultivation, and that like she can become something better, greater than I can necessarily see or understand, and I have to be trying to push her towards that goal, rather than insisting that she limit, because this is kind of like the rational male thing, is like the man sets a frame and the woman comes and lives within his frame, makes a map essentially. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine if your only goal is to like have a peaceful household or something like that. And it's like, but well, if it's always making it be like she's got to be dependent on you, and this is something I think people don't think about a lot because the main thing everybody's worried about is divorce, especially men. And so it's like, oh, if you keep your wife in a state of dependency, that's going to lessen the likelihood that she's just going to choose to divorce you. But this is kind of a modern and recent problem to worry about. And historically, the bigger concern as a man is, what if you die? And if you die and your wife has been completely dependent on you, and especially if you have children, well, that means that she's going to be dependent on some other man. She's going to need to find some other man, and that could be horrible, or if depending on what the options are, you might be putting her in a bad situation. But if you cultivate her towards, not like with the intention that she will leave you. I mean, I guess that's the risk. It's kind of like, I have to cultivate in you enough growth and independence so that you could be capable of standing on your own, even though that might increase the possibility that I get left. But in case I die, then I know she's going to be okay, or something like that. So, yeah. And then just to put a cap on it, then thinking about, like, for men, the non-rational choice is always death. And that's even what Christ does, that he makes that non-rational choice. So I think that's why men are way more drawn towards death as a a fascination.
That's fantastic. So there's a few things. I actually think the dynamics you see in marriage really map on to these political questions we're talking about, because basically what ends up happening is we don't know how to have a social order without an authority. And so basically you make everyone feel the map. So you have men that are like, well, I'll have the woman assemble, kind of map on to my map. And then that map is indestructible. So she's safe, but then it can run the risk of creating a suboptimal result because you don't have the neurodiversity. You don't have the non-rationality of the woman to deal with situations that are beyond your map. And when that occurs, the man can have a tendency to just hunker down and stick to their map, as opposed to actually listening to the wife, or maybe the wife is afraid to speak, or that can happen. I think for me, so much of the language of non-rationality, because we've existed for so long, stuck in either rational or irrational, that has greatly contributed to political, marital, social suboptimal results, because we basically believe if you're not rational, you're irrational, and then we're doomed. And then there's no space for menti-divergency at all. And as a result, we've carried that to the political, we've carried that to market, we've carried that to family, and all of these different spaces. And that has led to, well, suboptimal results and various pathologies and problems, right? But here's the issue. In order to have the non-rational that, say, the woman in general, and of course we're speaking generally, can provide. And I've had a lovely I really love Sam Green's work on this topic, where we've talked about apprehension versus calculation, her story, The Mermaid, and she's doing a lot of philosophical work on these kind of differences. And one way she'll put it, which I really like, and that we've talked about, and I'll throw it to Clayton here, is where generally, and of course we are speaking about generalities, and the name of the game is for everyone to actually work in concert with these different ways of thinking so that we can overcome Nash equilibria. And I really like your recent video on dating and what you were saying about everyone stuck in these conversations. That was really good. And I think that's a very real problem. Whereas, say, the man goes A to B to C, sequential, or 2 + 2 = 4 calculation, the female, and Sam will describe this well with the mermaid, when you have, say, the verbal processing, there's a gathering of all of the images of the day. There's a gathering of all of the information, and then suddenly, bam, apprehension, a conclusion. Similar to, say, you have the FedEx sign that has the negative arrow, and you walk around, suddenly you see the negative arrow, right? Or you have those optical illusions that gather together a bunch of small images, and suddenly you see the big image. They all form. You get the James Wiggy gestalt, right? So female intelligence can be more on the side, in my opinion, of the anagon, of the insight, of the analogy, that you gather. But here's the key. You don't know what image you could apprehend until you gather. So that's the issue. That's why it seems irrational, because you're just gathering all these things. You're talking about all these different stuff. How does this all connect? I don't get it. Bam. Like you won't get it until it connects, right? And often, here's the key, the thing that gets you through a Nash equilibrium can't be arrived at through rationality. It has to be arrived at by a different epistemological method. And the gathering apprehension, the gathering and see it, can be precisely the thing you can integrate into your rationality that actually now helps it not being suboptimal, right? But here's the key. You have to be a person that has the patience and the character and the virtue and the understanding to handle that difference. And if you don't, or we have a political system that can't handle that difference, we're doomed. We're all stuck in various Nash equilibria. And so there's this thing, I love it, and I'll throw it to Clayton here. There's a way where it's so important, and this is the Deleuzian problem. Like, I think about this all the time. Like, a family needs to, and he put it in the comments, create independence, like where there's independence in the family. But independence creates the possibility of no social. Because if we're independent, why do we need what? Here's the problem. If I'm independent, why do I need you? I don't, right? The whole idea of independency is I don't need you. So why are we married? Why are we gathering and having this conversation? Why are we together? Well, it's a non-rational choice. We're together because we believe it affords possibilities that otherwise are not afforded. There's an absolute choice that arises that has to happen. And I think we're in the age of actually thinking independent and the and I'll throw it to Clayton and Andrew. Good to see you. At the very beginning, I was talking about the relationship because I'm curious between theme, anagon, and beauty. Anagon being the fifth of catagen. So I think you heard us talking about that. But this issue of creating independence, and then why be together? Like that's always the trick with friendship. Like there's this weird thing where, like, why be friends if all it does is run the risk of misunderstanding and we don't need each other? Why do it? And that's what's happening. People like, why be married? Why be in relationships? I don't need one another. There's no reason to do it, right? Why? Well, if you don't have the concept of non-rationality, and this is where the beautiful becomes a big idea, if you don't have a concept of something being afforded by non-rational collectivity that can generate qualities of life and experience that otherwise are impossible, it's rational not to do it. And so people don't. And so then everyone's a hikikomori and separated and things like that. But those are excellent comments. Let me throw it to Clayton here. Clayton, I hope you're doing well on this fine day, sir.
Yeah, I couldn't speak before. I was stuck on a train, but now I'm off. So it feels exciting to be able to speak. One thing I really wanted to touch on is that aspect of non-rationality. And I think, like, what I want to point out is that I think we get trapped in the propositional way of seeing, and your propositional capability is what allows for rationality, because then it gives you all those kinds of memories you need for you to make the prediction. But what's not spoken about a lot, and which is heavily influencing all of this, is your implicit memory. And something I learned recently is, like, your implicit memory is, let's say, fully functional by the time you're 30 weeks old as an embryo. So it's like already recording the events that are happening at that point in time, like, and it keeps recording. And your propositional faculties are only going to develop as much as the implicit memory is going to allow for. And why I'm saying that is because we highly undermine that whole implicit memory space, because we like to think propositionally. And from a propositional perspective, anything that seems not to make sense propositionally is non-rational. It's not reasonable at all, right? And so, but there are things that are in us implicitly that had to be captured before we had language. So by definition, we cannot propositionally, you'd say, describe them. And so we do not have a language for them. And so when you study like in trauma, a lot of traumatic experiences are stored there because they're below language. And when you work with people to help them to work through trauma, one of the key aspects you're doing is you're languaging an experience that happened. And so all these IFS, all these systemic setups are really trying to recreate the event physically, such that a propositional language can be developed, and then those parts of the memory can kind of like get the data they need, such that they can fully process what happened and resolve it. Otherwise, it's an incomplete processing, which then becomes traumatic, because it's always giving you these implicit responses that you need, that drive you to respond a certain way. And then you go like, oh, I did that, but that's not rational. Why am I doing that? I need to fix it, because it doesn't fit the rational story, right, that I am creating. And so I would say, like, yes, the propositional and rationality is important, because then it gives us a strong sense of prediction. Like, we can then plan, we can then sort of like be more responsive to that which has not yet happened. And that's great. But I think, like, if we also respect what's happening in the implicit space, and which was sort of like labeling non-rational and all of these things, and sort of like, what is that thing? We use like a Stillmaning approach, rule omega. Like, let's not assume it's not rational. It's more like a rationality that is unlanguaged, I would say, and come at it with the attitude of trying to language the rationality we don't understand. It then increases our opportunity to sort of like see where it fits, to use Luba's language, like where it fits in the theme, right? Like, because there is a theme happening, like at an aeonic level, at a seasonal level, and that's always the story we're trying to fit, right? So like, what Sartori was saying before, like, you're trying to prepare yourself to die, because, like, in this theme, this is how your role ends. Like, your role ends by you getting out of it. But the question is, well, if you know that, what are you doing to not cause unnecessary disruption at that point, right? Like, you could be rational about it, right? Or you could choose to be, I don't want to say irrational, but you could choose to do something else, right? You could choose to do something else. But anyways, I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Absolutely delightful, and thank you for being here, Clay. Yeah, no, you said, and I'll throw it to Mr. Luber here, and if anyone has anything to say on this fine day, I'm actually thinking what you were saying on processing memory. It's also very interesting, because there's always this issue too, where, to use the language I've been using, the moment you do something non-rational and you get the optimal result, you can then retrospectively claim it was rational, right? So there's always this vanishing mediator move that can occur, which I would argue that's why in the paper, The True Isn't the Rational, there's this real emphasis on the phenomenology of making a choice that's non-rational, because the role of non-rationality is always vanishing the moment we make it. Like, even the role of experience in thinking, we're covering it with signifiers. Like, I have to experience a cup before I use the word cup, but the use of the word cup makes me forget the experience. So the role of non-rationality is always concealing. And the moment I do the non-rational, it's as if it was always rational to do, which then makes it, in a sense, it's a yet to be rationality. But the key is it's a rationality that is only afforded on the other side of the non-rational. That then it's kind of, the non-rational has this kind of laying down its life quality to it, actually. It has this kind of like vanishing, moving aside once you do it, which unfortunately, though, can set us up to make the mistake of not thinking it matters, because it's gone just as soon as we do it. And I actually think that one of the reasons we've actually gone through history basically overlooking the non-rational is because it has this vanishing quality to it. The moment you do it, retrospectively, it seems rational. Therefore, our very phenomenology of thinking contributes to autonomous rationality because of that vanishing structure it has there. The other thing I'm now thinking about as well, what you're saying with memory, Jockin and I were talking about how virtue is the reward of memory. When you don't have virtue, like you don't want to remember. So there's all these different layers. Like you don't want to remember if you don't have virtue, but then you have traumas that keep you from remembering. Maybe you repress. Like it's actually, what's just very interesting is that memory is a heck of a job. Like there is a lot of work that goes into memory. And in a way, the limits of your rationality are determined by the limits of your memory. Like the memory is a radical limitation. And to take the work of memory seriously is to take seriously the work of limit. Because also memory is interesting because if you reach a limit of memory, you also don't remember that it's a limit, so you don't know it's a limit. So the limits of memory are always invisible to you. So you have to constantly be in a place, like if a lot, and then I'll throw it to Luber here, if a lot of life is the problem of not knowing what you don't know, then you always have to be actively working, always actively processing. Because if there's something you don't know, well, then if you stop, you've got a problem, right? So there's always this need for a certain activity. Now, that's where Deleuze is correct. There's a need for a constant flow. But how do you have constant activity without going crazy? Like without like having no stability, right? I do think friendship is a big part of this. I do think conversation is a big part of this. I do think philosophical processes are a big part of this. I think courage is a big part of it, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing I was just going to say is that what you were saying about the necessity of processing, where there are things that are unprocessed that needs to be processed. One of the great problems following Deleuze is that our means of processing our, say, traumas or emotions or things we don't understand in of themselves create mechanisms of capture. So like the mental health complex, like Deleuze would talk about this with psychoanalysis, is that actually the ways that we process things we need to process, if we are not careful, actually are going to be in service of capture. And this is a major problem. And actually, like, for example, people will critique mental health and say, basically, being mentally healthy means you're a great employee for a business, right? Oh, interesting. So that's what constitutes mental health. Oh, okay. So you become capturable. But here's the issue. If you say, well, then we better have no processing, which I would argue is where Deleuze ends up with anti-Oedipus. Well, then you get madness. You get cheap Deleuze. So you need mechanisms of processing. And this is where there's a very interesting question of, is the following of the anagon and the theme and toward beauty actually the processing that we need to undergo that is non-capturable, that helps us work through our traumas, works through our difficulty to develop towards sainthood? Like we were saying with Jockin on this idea that the movement of the anagon is, you read, to base it on Cardinal Newman's wonderful book, The Grammar of Assent. So you're reading Shakespeare, you grasp that there's something here that sends you out to take a walk in the woods. Then you see the way the limb is against the moon, and you grasp something in that reminds you of the feeling you had with your mom. So then you go see your mom. So notice how there's a journey here. The journey of the grasping, the sacred romance that Cardinal Newman will say, this following, this Platonic searching for something that you don't know you're searching for. There's a question of if that's actually the proper way by which we process our lives. Like it is actually that journey that is the processing of traumas and difficulties, that actually if we don't process our lives through this grasping of the anagon, then we actually end up processing it, if we're not careful, through a means that is capturable. And yes, participate, absolutely. It's this kind of cosmic participation. And I think that's really important because I guess, Mr. Luber, what we were asking is if the anagon is the theme, precisely the means by which you identify which anagons you follow. Like if the anagon, as in the fifth, the grasping of the analogy, the analogical reasoning is the conclusion of analogical reasoning is the anagon. So you get an anagon, like the light is healthy, or you get a grasp of something. And we also talked a little bit about how every anagon is susceptible to being reduced to a principle. But there's actually something more alive that you're following. But how do you determine which anagons to follow or which anagons go together? It would seem as if that would be the theme. And that the theme is precisely like the anagon, the theme is in the anagon, but it is also the structuring of the anagons is then toward the beautiful. And that and that is all in a relationship of lack, a present absence, not nothing, but a present absence. So that's something we talked about. But Mr. Luber, you can talk about anything you want to on this fine afternoon, and I hope you are doing well down in Florida. I believe you are. So I hope it's well, sir.
I'm back. I'm back in LA.
You are a traveling madman. You're just friggin' Florida, then California. You're gonna be in Iowa tomorrow just because.
Maybe Virginia. Visit you.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
But no, I mean, Jock and I, we talked a lot to cover here. I guess a good starting place for me would be what's very interesting about what's very interesting that Aristotle does very simply is carving out tragedy and comedy. And now maybe Jockin has changed his mind on this since I've talked to him last about it, probably like a week ago or whatever. But that it seems like a tragic life, a tragic thematic unfolding we can associate very closely with the life of a saint. And that is different than a thematic unfolding that's a commedia, which would be the life of the virtuous person. So there's something to the different ways in which the end is met that help us understand whether the life that's being lived is a saintly life or a life that's a virtuous life, because they're not exactly the same. There's a great overlap, but there's difference. So with that being said, like everything you said, yes. I'm on board. I just want to add, I guess, that the anagon is something that you can't control. Like it's something that is existing when the life begins, and it doesn't get revealed until you enter the counterfactual realm. That aha moment, basically. So what theme does is, to use Jockin's distinction between analogy and metaphor, is that to be thematic to a significant degree means that your life is analogous and not metaphorical. So when you're not thematic, when it's kind of a shitty story, it's kind of a cliche, it's kind of a classic metaphor, basically. So I think at the end of the day, theme is operated in this context as some kind of like meta ethic that it has to do with being virtuous, but it also has to do with being saintly, which is not the same as being virtuous. Like, basically, most saints don't even know that they're a saint when they are a saint, right? And you can know if you're being a good person. You actually know, you can have knowledge on whether the activity that you are undergoing, the activity that you are participating in, whether that's virtuous or not. Like, you can have a sense of that. I think a saint, it would be almost like very weird for a saint to be able to sense, yeah, I'm being kind of saintly right now, I think. Like, that sounds like a joke, you know? But like, you could get a sense if you're being virtuous. Like, you could, it's like a certain disposition that you're in tune with. So I just think theme operates as a means of eliminating the different ways in which an unfolding can reveal an anagon. And ironically, the revealing of an anagon proves that there's a theme. I wouldn't say the anagon is the theme. Like there was a point where like Jockin was saying like the fifth is the theme. And like I agree with that. I think the fifth is actually what points to the theme, because I think theme is more process oriented than it relating to actuality itself, if that makes sense. Like theme only kind of, there only is a theme because there is an actuality already at play. So that's why this is where memory is so important, is because theme triggers, like a thematic pattern triggers a memory, which then reveals the analogy. There, ergo, the anagon has to be revealed. So I think from a very like practical standpoint, the whole move that we're trying to implore people to do is to live their life in a way that, and I'm trying to think of a more concrete way of putting it than just saying live a life in a way that affords the ability to see the anagon, because that's basically what the whole project is trying to do. That the beautiful, just in a certain sense, really captures the moment of that revelatory moment of the anagon. So it's very tricky, because the second you get too procedural with, oh, here's the procedure of how to live your life so you can see the anagon, that will cause you to not be able to see the anagon. Because if it's following a recipe, there is actually no analogy at play, because an analogy has to be worked out. It's not something that you just simply map. It's something that you have to kind of tease out and fuck with a little bit in order to really understand the analogy. I guess another thing that theme does here is that it prevents this from being just a univocal description of reality. Because the problem of the one and the many, I kind of say we solve it with this ambivocal dimension, which I just call theme, is for the sake of, and this is where I guess like the non-rational comes into play. It's for the sake of being able to see content in a way where you don't get fixed on that particular seeing of the content. That you give yourself the space that for your ego to not latch itself on to any kind of certainty. Because in a certain sense, certainty is the enemy here. But it's interesting, because I think dialectics, and this is where I really just need to like bite the bullet and like read like Science of Logic and like really do it. I've just been avoiding it. It's the difference between metaphor and analogy here, because it seems like the multiplicity helps. I think multiplicity and dialectic are both talking about metaphor at the end of the day. I don't know if it, from what I understand, I don't know if it's actually talking about analogy, because there's such an impasse in both schools of thought that it's hard to actually map an analogy on. I'm just thinking there's a chance that a lot of these thinkers aren't thinking analogically in this sense. And that's why it's so hard to communicate with these different thinkers, and why people would say, well, this person's just wrong and this person's just right. Because once you start really taking analogy seriously, oh, this person, whoops, it's more about like being able to build off of each other's thinking in order to see a new way of thinking. And like, that's what an analogy really does, is help you get to that place of the anagon, which is that new way of looking at things. And I'll just say one more thing. A big thing here is like, a lot of these philosophers are like, yeah, I'm writing this, and this is it. Like, this is the answer right here. What I'm giving you is the answer. When in reality, it's like, they should be thinking about in terms of, they're just like clearing a path for the future thinkers to think something new, and that that what they're actually writing about will go unfinished. They will die, and it will not be finished. That they are actually just helping the next person out, and like, that is an ego problem right there. Like, why people can't think like that. Like, it really, if they take that seriously, they'll literally change the way they like see their own projects, and they'll probably change their end conclusions on it, because there won't be a fixed endpoint per se. But anyway, I'll pass it off.
No, magnificent. I think your work has to be a space that people can enter that affords analogical possibility. The anagon, it has to be a girdle point. Like, if your work is not leading people to a girdle point, then it's a map in an indestructible system. And I think basically, yes, without the anagon, like, I'm in the opinion that most of history thinking has been in service of map making and internally consistent systems. And basically, without the anagon, that's all you can do, because you're stuck in thinkings of equivalence, of equal sign. And so the major problem, and then if anyone has anything to say this evening before I close and go eat the wonderful stir fry on this fine evening, is that how we are in the age of having to determine, what does it mean to think without an equal sign? What does it mean to act without an equal sign? Like, because you could say, so the dialectic is an equal sign. So speculative reason and transversality, Hegel and Deleuze, that I think is on the side of the anagon. The dialectic and the multiplicity are absolutely on the sides of metaphor, and metaphor is an equal sign. Where, like, it is like you say, the cheetah is like, she's as fast as a cheetah. There is no space of exploration. It's a one-to-one equal sign. She is fast, is what I'm saying. And an anagon, an analogy, is a space. If I say she is a cheetah, well, then what does that mean? I have to explore it. I have to enter into it. Now, that's not a great analogy, but if I say she's as fast as a cheetah, that's a metaphor, because you know exactly what I'm getting at. But if I say she is a cheetah, what does that mean? Like, I have to think about that. I have to explore it. So it's an opening. It's more of a space, right? And what you think that phrase means could be very different from what I think, or Sartori, or Clayton, or Daniel, Michael. Like, that, what that phrase means could be different. And so it invites a consideration, right? But basically, we've cheetahs. Zoom does not like cheetah. I don't know why Zoom doesn't like cheetahs. So dude, it's getting hot. I think it's 90 in Virginia, and for some reason our internet cannot handle heat or something like that. So I'm just gonna sing now. I don't know. I'm here? I don't even know. Okay, I came back. Did you like my singing? Oh, I know. I kept singing. Okay, so but anagon, she is a cheetah, has a space that you enter into, that you can debate. So it's less of an equal sign. Like, so much of the name of the game is we're having to figure out what it means to think, not an equal sign, and yet have not chaos. So it has to have direction. It has to point. It has to move. But the moment I say it's an equal sign, we're dealing with fungibility, exchangeability. We're removing definitiveness, and we have a problem. We are basically having to think, in my opinion, we are having to think an entirely new epistemology, which is therefore an onto-epistemology. In theology and philosophy and economics and every single field, the new mode of thinking that I do think Hegel is pointing to with speculative reason, I do think Deleuze is pointing to it with transversality, but never focused on it and then died. That dying thing always gets in the way. And definitely Leibniz is pointing to it with the analysis of citas, is thinking that is not primarily syllogistic or primarily an equal sign. Okay, just to say it quite simplistically, because there are no equal signs. Nothing in reality equals one another, because then there's not two, there's one. If two things equal one another, there's not two things. It's the ultimate mistake that we've made. Like we think thinking is about equaling something, but there's no equaling in reality. There's only equaling if you're dealing with single dimensionality, like 2 + 2 = 4. But there are no numbers. I've never seen numbers walking around. There are two apples, but there are not numbers walking around, right? So equal signs are in algebra per se, but not higher dimensionality geometry. But then how do you think without an equal sign? That's what the anagon is getting at. And you can only get the anagon in the girdle point, in the point where the map fails, because otherwise it's just syllogism. It's just like, okay, it's part of the map, right? So most of history has been in service of map making in equal signs, in equivalence. Well, more equivalence is not the same as equal sign, but it's the equal sign. So now, in the age of global pluralism, in the age of diversity and all of this, we have to think what is thinking without an equal sign that nevertheless has a towardness and a possibility of a unification. And that is what we're getting at with the anagon. And the anagon, which is analogous, is a way to make something intelligible without defining it. Like I am able, when I say she's a cheetah, that creates intelligibility, and yet it's really hard to say what it is, and yet it's not nothing. Like there's intelligibility, but it's not totalizing. And I have to get in there, I have to participate in it. So that becomes the kind of thinking, epistemologically, of which philosophy, theology, economics, and all of the things should be in service of, because it is taking place in the incompleteness in the girdle point, of which is necessary for us not to just end up in infinite Nash equilibria, dang it, over and over again. But the anagon then is to say the point of thinking is the determination of likeness, of following likeness, although likeness is simplistic, which of course in a Christian structure makes sense. If you're made in the image and likeness of God, then the point of thinking of the logos is likeness, because it's all isomorphic, it all follows one another. And the thing that I think is also the case is that people cannot process. It's a giant claim that would require justification. And then I'll close unless anyone has anything else to say on this evening, is that you can't process your traumas, you can't process your life, you can't process your memories actually other than the process of following the anagon. Like the girdle point is the place where you can process. If you do not engage in processing in the girdle point, your processing is part of the map, an internally consistent system, which means it's repressive, which means you can cope, but not process. You can repress, but not process. And basically, without this kind of thinking, I think, well, again, this gets into Korbosky. This is all my beloved Alfred Korbosky, who's basically saying, yeah, if we don't move beyond the equal sign, we're going to end up in an age of radical mental illness because there are no equal signs. That's what he was saying in the 1910s. He's like, we're going to go insane because A is A, equivalence is not reality. It is more geometrical. But so what happens is basically we cannot process in the way we need to process to be human, except in the girdle point. But here's the key. Now, to be clear, the necessity of the girdle point is corollary to the amount of diversity you're encountering. That's why you could have people in history who were not necessarily, they were just map making, but they weren't encountering diversity. So it was technically not the adequate place, but practically could still function because you were not encountering regularly the incompleteness that you then had to deal with. And once you do that, history has reached a point where you have to dwell in the girdle point because you no longer have, because it's going to keep encountering it. You can't just simply engage in map sealing. That has to be expanded on. But the point is, our age now is dealing with a lot of people who have something they need to process, but we don't have the ontoepistemology of the girdle point, which is the place where you can engage in that processing as needed for global pluralism, because it needs to follow the anagon. It needs non-rationality, or you're just going to keep ending up in Nash equilibrium, which are the causes very often of people's traumas or relational problems or the things that they need, that they then need therapy to process, are these Nash equilibria situations that they just keep running into time again. So the stakes are high. I think the last thing I'll say, Mr. Luber, is I do wonder if the relationship is, again, just the whole concentric circle things, where it's if you get to beauty, you get theme and anagon as well. But if you get to theme, you also get anagon. But if you just go to anagon, you don't get theme. But it's like if it's the concentric circle problem. Like if you follow it all the way, you get them all. But if you don't, then you don't, right? And so I think that's the same thing. And then, of course, because there's also a question here of what's the difference between the anagon and just like a gut feeling. Like I have a gut feeling, or or like seeing connections that aren't there, like a false gestalt or a conspiracy, right? What's the difference between a false gestalt and an anagon? Well, the theme. I mean, so there's this weird way in which without a theme, and then do you get a theme if it's not toward beauty? You know, that gets into that question, which is very important. But the point is that the anagon actually, yeah, exactly, probably not. The anagon without the theme ends up in conspiracy, map sealing, and internally consistent structure and madness, right? So if you get an anagon that isn't leading toward madness, then it is in a theme. Therefore, it has social potential. Therefore, it has the possibility of being socially embedded. So there's a weird way in which if you don't get the theme, and you know, Mr. Sartori, forgive, theme is a term that Mr. Luber has worked on for a very long time, and and he has a tremendous book on that topic that he's been working on. It's really, really important. But the point is that in the theme, you get an anagon that is in service of possibly the social as opposed to ending up in madness. And then, of course, theme ends up in tragedy, if not toward the beautiful. So there's a relation there. But I will run on this fine evening unless anyone else has anything to say. I will go eat the stir fry. Mr. Sartori, thank you for coming. Everyone, do check out Sartori's work, Tense Before Temples. It's a wonderful book. I really appreciate it very much. And his website. I appreciate the videos he's been making. And thank you all for being here.